The 9,442nd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. Members of the Council have before them document S/2023/773, the text of a draft resolution submitted by Brazil. The Council is ready to proceed to the vote on the draft resolution before it. The representative of the Russian Federation has submitted amendments to the text of the draft resolution. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, During consultations on the 17th of October, many members of the Council sought to dissuade us to vote on our humanitarian depoliticized draft resolution. We were asked to wait 24 hours in order to reach a consensus draft resolution. We did not agree with that, and we were right, because ultimately, after almost 2 days, the vote is on a resolution that is slightly changed but was not discussed by the members of the Council. We regret that the Council wasted a very precious 36 hours, during which time the number of casualties increased. The strike on the hospital in Gaza yesterday killed hundreds of people. Given this, the inaction from the Security Council looks appalling. Yesterday, we did warn colleagues that we just can't waste any time now. Distinguished colleagues, I will speak frankly. The time for diplomatic metaphors is long gone. Everybody who did not support our humanitarian resolution with a call for a swift ceasefire must understand that they bear some of the responsibility for what happened. The Brazil draft resolution, unfortunately, will not help to avoid such tragedies from occurring. There is no clear call in it for a ceasefire. This is a very important thing to de-escalate the situation on the ground. It's very important wording. That has been replaced with humanitarian pauses and giving unhindered access to UN workers. But that's not the same thing. Humanitarian pauses will not help to stop the bloodshed. It is only a ceasefire that will help to do this. Furthermore, the draft still has a number of political elements in it that push us to one side and do not talk about the absolute unacceptability of the attacks on civilians in the Gaza Strip, and also as on civilian objects. The importance of this is absolutely crystal clear for everyone right now. And so we have proposed 2 amendments to address these issues. The first is an unambiguous call for a stop on the indiscriminate attacks against civilians in the Gaza Strip and on civilian objects, including the attack on the Al Ali hospital, that airstrike, and also the strong condemnation of the imposition of the blockade. The second adds to the OP a new point on the call for an immediate, durable and fully respected humanitarian ceasefire. If these are not included in the text of the document, it will not help to address the tragic, devastating humanitarian situation in Gaza. Rather, it will just worsen the divide in between members of the committee and will polarize the positions of members of the international community. We would urge members of the Council to vote in support of the amendments proposed by Russia. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. Would any other member wish to take the floor? I see none. Members of the Council have before them proposed amendments submitted by the Russian Federation to the text of the draft resolution contained in document S/2023/773 submitted by Brazil. Rule 36 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure states the following. If 2 or more amendments to a motion or draft resolution are proposed, the President shall rule on the order in which they are to be voted upon. Ordinarily, the Security Council shall first vote on the amendment furthest removed in substance from the original proposal, and then on the amendment next furthest removed until all amendments have been put to the vote. But when an amendment adds to or deletes from the text of a motion or draft resolution, that amendment shall be voted on first. Accordingly, I intend to put the proposed amendments to the vote first. I shall now put to the vote the proposed amendment to be inserted after operative paragraph 2 of the draft resolution. This amendment is contained in document S/2023/775. Will those in favor of the proposed amendment to be inserted after operative paragraph 2 contained in document S/2023/775 please raise their hand? Against? Abstentions? The result of the voting is as follows. Six votes in favor, 1 vote against, 8 abstentions. The proposed amendment has not been adopted, having failed to obtain the required number of votes. It's after. Okay. I shall now put to the vote the proposed amendment to be inserted before operative paragraph 1 of the draft resolution. This amendment is contained in document S/2023/776. Will those in favor of the proposed amendment to be inserted before operative paragraph 1 contained in document S/2023/776 please raise their hand? In favor. Against? Abstentions? The result of the voting is as follows. 7 votes in favor, 1 vote against, 7 abstentions. The proposed amendment has not been adopted, having failed to obtain the required number of votes. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor.
Господин председатель, уважаемые коллеги.
Distinguished Mr. President, distinguished delegates, the vote on the immediate ceasefire and on an unequivocal condemnation of the indiscriminate attack did not get passed. Those delegations who either abstained or voted against essentially were against the cessation of a bloodshed in the Middle East. There can be no other explanations of it. Of course, the colleagues here saying, well, their justification was not balanced. But all of these complaints are just going to be empty. You've made your choice, however, and you are going to have to bear responsibility for it to the countries, people of your countries, and to the people in the region, and the people who are living under this terrible, deadly threat. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. It is my understanding that the Council is ready to proceed to the vote on the draft resolution contained in document S/2023/773 submitted by Brazil. I shall put the draft resolution to the vote now. Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2023/773 please raise their hand? Will those against? Abstentions? The result of the voting is as follows: 12 votes in favor, 1 vote against, 2 abstentions. The draft resolution has not been adopted owing to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Council. No. The draft resolution, no. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements after the vote. Right. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Brazil. Dear colleagues, at last Friday's closed consultations, Council members asked for Brazil's leadership in our capacity as presidency in October to facilitate a Council response to the escalating crisis in Israel and Palestine, in particular its humanitarian aspects. We heeded the call with a sense of urgency and responsibility. In our view, the Council had to take action and to do so very quickly. Council paralysis in the face of a humanitarian catastrophe is not in the interest of the international community. Therefore, throughout last weekend and the following days, we worked very hard through extensive and collaborative engagement with Council members to help build a unified position. While making a good faith effort to accommodate different, sometimes opposing positions, our focus was and remains on the critical humanitarian situation on the ground. Political realism guided us, but our sight was always set on the humanitarian imperative. Exactly as in other very sensitive files on the Council's agenda in which Brazil had a special role to play, international humanitarian law and human rights law provided a clear framework for action. Our proposed text unequivocally condemned all forms of violence against civilians, including the heinous acts of terrorism by Hamas and the taking of hostages. It called for their immediate and unconditional release. It also called on all parties to strictly abide by their international legal obligations, in particular those relating to the protection of civilians, civilian infrastructure, and humanitarian personnel. The draft resolution also stressed the urgent need for humanitarian access to civilians. The text incorporated urgent and multiple calls by the UN and many other actors for humanitarian pauses to allow for the delivery of aid and the voluntary safe passage of civilians. It encouraged the establishment of humanitarian corridors and other mechanisms to facilitate the smooth delivery of aid. The draft further reflected the ethical necessity to provide civilians in Gaza with electricity, water, fuel, food, and medical supplies. The necessity to be protected from forced relocation when the prevailing conditions on the ground do not ensure a safe and secure displacement. Thus, faced with heinous terrorist acts against Israeli civilians, with the forceful reaction to such acts and an ever-growing humanitarian disaster imposed on Gaza, the Council response we proposed was robust and balanced. We are grateful to all Council members who engaged with us since last Friday and demonstrated a sincere and practical commitment to multilateralism. Sadly, very sadly, the Council was yet again unable to adopt a resolution on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Again, silence and inaction prevailed, to no one's true long-term interest. While we deeply regret that collective action is made impossible in the Security Council, we do hope that efforts by other actors will yield positive results. They must be prompt, effective, and substantial. Hundreds of thousands of civilians in Gaza cannot wait any longer. Actually, they have waited for far too long, to no avail. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. And I'll give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, dear colleagues, we have just been witnesses once again of hypocrisy and the double standards of our American colleagues, not standing in principle in the Security Council. They really did not want to have any solution found here. So because of this, they had to just be very obvious as to what their intentions were before us here all today. Now, I'm not going to waste your time on going on about this. I think it's crystal clear what's happened. But I would just like to talk about what the head of Lockheed Martin, James Head, said yesterday, talking to the American media. He said there's no point in restraining Israel from any military actions. What is the point in the future development of our military-industrial complex, which will increase by at least 2% of GDP? There are conflicts which need to be resolved with arms, and we are prepared to provide these arms, these weapons, end of quote. As we say, no comment. Really, that is the very essence of the US's policy in the region and the Pacific region. We do hope that thanks to that, our international partners, after today's vote, will have no illusions about that and what they're intending whatsoever. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation, and I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, as we meet, President Biden is in the region. His trip is a clear demonstration of the fact that the United States is actively engaging at the highest levels to secure the release of hostages, to prevent the conflict from spreading, to stress the need to protect civilian lives, to address the humanitarian crisis facing Palestinians in Gaza, and to demonstrate to the Israeli people that the United States stands with them in their time of sorrow and need. We are on the ground doing the hard work of diplomacy, and while we recognize Brazil's desire to move this text forward, we believe we need to let that diplomacy play out, especially when Secretary General Guterres, President Biden, Secretary Blinken, and regional actors are engaged in intensive dialogue on the very issues we are deliberating on today. Yes, resolutions are important, and yes, this Council must speak out, but the actions we take must be informed by the facts on the ground and support direct diplomacy efforts that can save lives. The Council needs to get this right. Colleagues, the United States is disappointed this resolution made no mention of Israel's rights of self-defense. Like every nation in the world, Israel has the inherent right of self-defense as reflected in Article 51 of the UN Charter. Following previous terrorist attacks by groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS, this Council reaffirmed that right. This text should have done the same. Though we could not support this resolution going forward, we will continue to work closely with all Council members on this pressing issue, just as we will continue to reiterate the need to protect civilians, including members of the media, humanitarian workers, and UN officials. And when I talk about the protection of civilians, I mean all civilians. The United States is horrified and saddened by yesterday's explosion at the Ali Arab Hospital in Gaza. We mourn this tragic loss of life. On the humanitarian front, we are working with Israel, its neighbors, the United Nations, and other partners to address the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. It is critical that food, medicine, water, and fuel begin flowing into Gaza as soon as possible. Families, the elderly, and children are in dire need. Let's be clear. Hamas's own actions have brought this on, this severe humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And Hamas has caused so much needless suffering, death, and destruction. Every member state should condemn Hamas's terrorism and cruelty, and every member state should call on Hamas to cease its endless barrage of rockets against Israel. This is not complicated. It's not controversial. This is the bare minimum. Colleagues, at this difficult moment, let us all call for the protection of civilians and unequivocally condemn Hamas. Let us all affirm Israel's right of self-defense and support the urgent diplomatic efforts underway. Let us stand with the UN and other partners as they work to alleviate the humanitarian crisis facing Palestinians in Gaza. And let us all support equal measures of justice and freedom for Israelis and Palestinians alike. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States, and I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. Malta voted in favor of the draft resolution tabled by Brazil. Malta has also abstained on the 2 amendments proposed by the Russian Federation. Although we have no issue with the substance, we saw no reason to alter a well-crafted resolution that rests on a delicate balance and that sought Council unity on this critical matter. We deeply regret that We deeply regret that the draft resolution was not adopted and remain gravely concerned at the highly volatile situation in Israel and Gaza. Notwithstanding this decision, the Council must critically remain seized with the matter and strive to work towards constructive steps which prioritize the protection of civilians and prevent any potential regional conflagration. Within this context, Malta unequivocally condemns in the strongest possible terms the barbaric terrorist acts perpetrated by Hamas on Israeli soil and against the people of Israel. Malta emphasizes that Israel has the right to self-defense in the face of such violent and indiscriminate attacks. It has the right and obligation to protect its territory and its people in line with humanitarian and international law and the principles of distinction and proportionality. We also reiterate our call on Hamas to unconditionally and safely release the hostages immediately. President, we deeply regret that casualties of this war have already included numerous medical, humanitarian, and UN staff. Hundreds were killed in yesterday's horrific strike on the Al-Ahli Baptist Hospital in Gaza that was sheltering thousands of displaced. Such actions are deplorable. They are a blunt breach of international law, which categorically prohibits endangering civilians, medical staff, and humanitarian establishments. This is the inevitable result of the military operations that are being conducted in Gaza, one of the most densely populated places on earth. Decisions to cut off electricity, water supply, and refuse supplies of aid and fuel are also deeply concerning and are leading to catastrophic results. The evacuation order, which displaced over 1 million people to South Gaza, has had serious humanitarian consequences. Such decisions are inconsistent with international humanitarian law and must be rescinded. Malta also stresses the crucial importance that there be a rapid, unhindered humanitarian access to Gaza and urges the immediate establishment of humanitarian corridors in this regard. At this juncture, the importance of preventing a regional spillover is critical. It is therefore imperative for all parties to exercise maximum restraint and fully comply with the norms of international law. Our efforts moving forward must be steadfast in aligning with a just and comprehensive resolution of the Middle East conflict. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the night before last, I already gave a comprehensive account of China's views on the current situation in Palestine and Israel. In the next emergency meeting, I shall elaborate on China's position. I shall focus on China's position on today's vote, on the fact that the draft resolution failed to be adopted, and our reaction is that of shock and disappointment. The night before last, the Russian resolution focused on the situation in Palestine and Israel, focusing on the protection of civilians. And that resolution adopted received a lot of support from countries. However, some countries have chosen to cast a negative vote. The reason given at the point was that they were actually more intended to base their positions on the resolution tabled by Brazil, so to get more time to deliberate. The colleagues from Brazil and other colleagues have agreed to that request by postponing the meeting for another 24 hours. And now it's been proposed again to this point. Over the past 40 hours, they have neither commented on nor expressed opposition to the Brazilian draft, and which led us to expect that today, hopefully, they will vote in favor of this resolution, and the Council will be able to adopt the resolution favorably. However, the final result of the vote is nothing short of unbelievable. It is also the belief of China that the Brazilian resolution still has rooms for improvement. It should send a strong message asking for ceasefire and protection of civilians so as to prevent humanitarian catastrophe. Therefore, China has proposed amendments that are intended to improve the draft, while at the same time agreeing with the Russian amendments. On the Russian amendment, the fact that it failed to be adopted, we are simply very disappointed. That being the case, in view of the fact that the situation in Gaza is deteriorating rapidly, what happened yesterday, that is the airstrike on the hospital and things like that, resulted in civilian casualties in the hundreds. Therefore, the Council has to take rapid actions. China condemns strongly the airstrike against hospitals, and we urge Israel to effectively abide by the obligations under the international humanitarian law. We call for ceasefire and protection of civilians so as to prevent further civilian casualties. The draft resolution tabled by Brazil in general reflects the general view of the international community, representing the initial steps to be taken by the Council to achieve a ceasefire. and they could be possibly the only possible draft that the Council can reach consensus on under the current circumstances. Some countries are already saying that the Council should take a correct action. However, the way they voted on the text in question makes us doubt their willingness for the Council to take real actions and their willingness to find a solution to the problem. In the final analysis, the Council should not stand on its hands. The current situation in Gaza is escalating. More and more civilians are paying the prices with their lives and bearing the brunt of the conflict. And therefore, on the question of ceasefire and cessation of hostilities and protection of civilians, the Council has to effectively shoulder its responsibility and play its due role. Thank you.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, Mozambique wishes to commend Brazil and your presidency for the excellent leadership in conducting this work, which is thorny but important. We also thank you for providing the Security Council with a very valuable text. We have voted in favor of the draft resolution. We deeply regret that the draft could not be adopted due to a veto. In voting in favor, Mozambique wishes to express our deep concern over the outbreak and escalation of violence and deterioration of the situation in Gaza, and consequently, the unfolding humanitarian crisis. Moreover, we are deeply concerned about the human lives that are being lost on a daily basis since the conflict erupted. The civilian population, mainly children, women, and the elderly, are suffering the most from the atrocities and grave effects of this war. In supporting this resolution, Mozambique associates ourselves with the collective efforts of this Council aimed at ensuring the protection of civilians and the respect for international human rights law, international humanitarian law, the Geneva Convention, as applied to this conflict both in Gaza and in Israel. It is our strong call that humanitarian aid must reach the needy populations in Gaza. That includes the provision of essential goods and services, as well as medical supplies. Mr. President, we are conscious of the fact that ultimately humanitarian problems need political solutions. This belief reflects our own experience, originated from our protracted struggle against colonialism, racism, and apartheid in the Southern African region. In this context, we urge all the parties to immediately stop attacks, refrain from further violence, and engage in constructive dialogue. Mozambique firmly believes that Israel and Palestine can only resolve their differences through dialogue. We hold the view that peace is always possible if the conflicting parties are genuinely willing to follow the path of justice and tolerance. We therefore wish to reiterate our appeal to the members of this council to redouble our efforts toward a sustainable solution to the Israeli-Palestine conflict. We believe the Palestinian people and the Israeli people have their inalienable right to statehood. They can live together, side by side, in peace and security as good neighbors. As a matter of fact, the Charter compels the parties, and indeed the entire international community, to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me begin by thanking your presidency and all delegations for the efforts made to have a consensual resolution that could have helped support the efforts of this Council to de-escalate the rising tensions and respond to the tragic situation that we are all witnessing in the Gaza Strip and in southern Israel. We deeply regret that the resolution could not pass. For Ghana, we have always held that the Council should, as far as possible, speak in one voice on this important dispute, whose fault lines reach many distant parts of the world. We have therefore, from the very beginning, given priority to the efforts entrusted to the presidency to lead all of us in that direction. It was in this regard also that we voted in favor of the Brazilian draft resolution, but deemed it important to abstain from the draft resolution proposed on Monday night and the amendments to today's resolution to preserve the broadest possible agreement that was found to guide us in a common direction. Despite the high sensitivities of the decades-old Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the differences in approaches we may have in resolving it, what should be paramount is our historic responsibility as a Council to deliver the two-state solution and preserve the lives of the two nations whose destinies are bound by history and a common and shared area. The Council's inability to act on its responsibility today, however, should not break our resolve. We believe that a united Council voice and action on the matter is still required and critical in stabilizing the situation and assisting the parties to enter into dialogue, which is the only viable path to durable peace. We should therefore continue to ask the parties to de-escalate, seek consensus to support mediation efforts, and knock on the doors of all those that can have a moderating influence on the parties to open up the space for dialogue. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Japan voted in favor of the resolution because it can support its main ideas, bearing in mind various perspectives, including the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Japan has unequivocally condemned the terror attacks by Hamas and others, and called for the immediate release of those who were kidnapped. We feel strong indignation at the tremendous damage and harm to innocent civilians brought by the attack on a hospital in Gaza City on the 17th. At the same time, we would like to point out that Japan had asked to delay the vote on this resolution proposed by Brazil, understanding that various countries, including the United States, have been continuing to make diplomatic efforts on the ground to improve the situation as soon as possible. Japan expresses its great regret at the fact that the resolution was voted to a vote today nevertheless. Japan has consistently and strongly supported and put a face in diplomatic efforts by US President Biden and other relevant countries. All of us, including those who refer to hypocrisy in particular, should think twice if we are really faithful to human rights principles and if we are doing sufficient efforts to make difference on the ground in improving humanitarian situation. Actions are needed. Japan will continue to work together with other countries to ensure the safety of civilians and realize an early de-escalation of the situation. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Japan, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. On the 7th of October already, Switzerland firmly condemned the terrorist acts, the indiscriminate attacks and hostage-taking perpetrated by Hamas against the Israeli people. We deplore the deaths of thousands of civilians, including hundreds of children in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, particularly Gaza. Switzerland echoes the Secretary-General in condemning unequivocally the strikes, particularly those which, according to United Nations figures, have led to hundreds of deaths and dozens of injured yesterday in the Al-Ahli Hospital, Anglican Episcopal Church. And we express our sincere condolences to the injured and the victims. We are concerned regarding the large-scale humanitarian crisis in Gaza and the dramatic situation faced by civilians. Almost 1 million people have been displaced, and it is urgent for humanitarian aid to be able to enter. Water, electricity and medical supplies are dwindling. We have all spoken around this table yesterday about the situation in the Middle East, which requires united, urgent action by the Council. De-escalation, protection of civilians, humane treatment for all hostages, and Switzerland calls for immediate release, as well as rapid, safe, unhindered humanitarian access are all priorities. The draft resolution tabled by Brazil met these priorities, with aiming for a common understanding by this Council, which is why we voted in favour of it, and very much regret the failure to adopt the resolution put to the vote today. I wish to thank your delegation once again, President, for your sustained commitment. It is regrettable that we have not yet been able to reach consensus on a product showing our unity in the face of this situation. Independently of the adoption of a resolution, all the parties must uphold international humanitarian law, particularly the principles of distinction, proportionality and precaution, as well as human rights. International humanitarian law takes account of legitimate security and military needs. All of these rules must therefore be respected with no exception. President, Switzerland has deployed every effort to contribute to reaching consensus on a Council product in this urgent situation. Along these same lines, we remain at your disposal to support any new initiatives which could result in action by this Council. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. This morning, this Council is seeing its credibility put to the test, given the scope of the deadly violence in Israel and Gaza and the extreme gravity of the crisis in the Middle East, whose shockwave is threatening peace and security in the whole of the region and beyond. As a Security Council, our mandate is to halt wars, or failing that, to prevent them and to alleviate the human suffering born of crises. This morning, the Security Council was not equal to this mandate. The rhetoric around this table provided no succor, no help to civilians in Gaza, who are falling in the face of indiscriminate strikes by missiles and rockets, and who are deprived of all means of survival. Once again, politics and geopolitics have paralyzed this Council's capacity for action. This Council is not reacting in the face of horror and the screams of distress of civilians, in the face of one of the most serious crises in the Middle East, and we are counting the deaths and the destruction whilst remaining powerless. This Council has not provided any coherent response to provide a glimmer of hope to the children, the women, the hostages, and the peoples of the world who were watching our deliberations for their survival and for saving them. My country voted in favour of the draft resolution tabled by the Brazilian presidency and the 2 amendments proposed, because it is crucial and urgent to act, having issued strong condemnations of the barbaric attacks against Israel on the 7th of October last, and recognised Israel's right to legitimate defence, whilst upholding the principles of proportionality and distinction with regard to combatants and civilians. We firmly believe that given the magnitude of the deadly violence, which over a few days has caused thousands of deaths and immeasurable humanitarian distress, we must call for an immediate cessation of hostilities and the opening of humanitarian corridors to alleviate the suffering of civilians. Our position has been clear since the first Council meeting. Hostage-taking is unacceptable and unjustifiable and indefensible, and we reiterate the hostages must be released with no conditions and no blackmail. We regret the fact that the Council was unable to overcome its divisions. We must certainly show greater responsibility so as to find a solution to the crisis in the Middle East, whose chronic nature questions our credibility and tarnishes our reputation. For Gabon, the 2-state solution is the only credible alternative. We can and must achieve this through diplomacy, good faith negotiation, and overcoming fears and self-interest, which are distancing us from our collective responsibility of maintaining peace and security in the region and beyond. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And let me start by thanking you for your good faith efforts to negotiate this resolution. The draft resolution on which we have just voted rightly condemns the appalling Hamas terrorist attacks on Israel on the 7th of October. It also makes clear that all actions need to be taken in line with international humanitarian law. It stresses the importance of ensuring humanitarian access and protecting civilians, and emphasises this Council's shared priority of preventing regional escalation of the conflict. We welcome and support the draft resolution's attempts to set out the Council's view on these critical points. But the draft resolution needed to be clearer on Israel's inherent right to self-defense in line with the UN Charter after Hamas attacks killed over 1,400 people and took almost 200 people hostage. The draft resolution also ignored the fact that Hamas are using innocent Palestinian civilians as human shields. They have embedded themselves in civilian communities and made the Palestinian people their victims too. For these reasons, the United Kingdom abstained on this resolution. My Prime Minister has been clear that the UK stands with Israel in the face of these atrocities. We support Israel's right to defend itself against Hamas, take back the hostages, deter further incursions, and strengthen its security for the long term. In so doing, we will continue to call on Israel to take all feasible precautions to avoid harming Palestinian civilians and to act in line with international humanitarian law. We will continue to work closely with Israel and our partners in the region to respond to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, to ensure that civilians are protected and have access to food, water, medicine, and shelter, and to work towards the peace and stability promised by the two-state solution. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Señor Presidente.
President, we voted in favor of the draft tabled by the Brazilian presidency, as did many other members of this council. It was the result of a constructive collective negotiating process by all members of the council. And we are convinced that the collective work and negotiation in good faith are indispensable for effective multilateralism. And these are the best way to fulfill the responsibilities placed upon us. We fully believe, President, that the Council cannot continue in silence in the face of events which are clearly a threat to international peace and security, and which are already having serious humanitarian consequences. The Brazilian presidency's draft includes elements which are necessary in the face of a situation which is worsening by the minute. The credibility of the Council depends upon our decisions at times like this. In this regard, Ecuador abstained with regard to the amendments, since these are elements which are covered in the resolution. We regret the fact that once again the Council was unable to adopt a resolution through the use of the veto. But this is not the end of our efforts. We will do everything within our reach to ensure that the Council can very soon pronounce itself and act with regard to this conflict. President, on the 24th of September 1973, the Ecuadorian Chancellor Antonio Lucio Paredes spoke before the General Assembly and said, and I quote, that it is necessary for the actions of the great powers which in one way or another support the parties to the conflict in the Middle East be guided towards seeking solutions to establish constructive peace and do not hamper possible agreements and understandings. The Middle East conflict, because of its explosive nature, compels the United Nations to tirelessly attempt to bring an end to it. Close quote. These words remain valid, even though they were said over 50 years ago. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Brazil for their efforts, the diligence in providing time, and the continued engagement with all the Security Council members. The text came at a very critical moment, not only for the conflict between Israel and Hamas and the huge impact it's having on civilians, but also for the revived dangers for the region and beyond. Albania voted in favor because the text responded to core objectives on the issue and to our coherent and principled position. It strongly and unequivocally condemned Hamas and its indefensible terrorist attacks on Israel on 7 October 2023. It called for the immediate release of the hostages, which should remain a humanitarian priority, as the Secretary General called upon Hamas last Sunday. They should be released immediately and unconditionally. It provided for the protection of civilians in accordance with international humanitarian law and the flow of the humanitarian aid to all those in need. It also supports the regional and international efforts for a solution on the ground and embraces a diplomatic solution to the crisis. In this respect, we commend the very active engagement at every level by the United States and others to finding the best solutions on the ground. While we supported the draft, Albania reaffirms its position in full support of Israel and its right to self-defense, like every other nation under attack, which the resolution falls short to mention. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, it is perhaps beyond me to put into words the abject horrors we are witnessing in Gaza. That is why the United Arab Emirates fully supported the Council to take action today, and we still support that the Council does take action on this situation. For more than 140 years, the Al Ahli Baptist Hospital has provided medical care and shelter for generations of Gazans. Yesterday, more than 500 Palestinians were killed in a strike that hit the hospital. Each passing hour of this ruinous war makes a mockery of these principles of international humanitarian law. Gaza is laid to waste, and nobody feels safe. We call for a full, independent investigation into this incident, and for those who are responsible to be held accountable. As we verify information about the strike, one fact still remains indisputable. More Palestinians have died in this outbreak of violence than in any other in the history of the conflict. In less than 2 weeks of bombardment, more than 3,500 Palestinians have been killed and more than 14,000 injured. Will we continue to sit here and compare the casualties on both sides? We support no less than a full humanitarian ceasefire. We don't ask for this to be done at the expense of Israel's security, but so that people may tend to their wounded, bury their dead in dignity, and begin putting their lives back together. This ceasefire is also crucial so that vital humanitarian aid may enter and aid workers do their work safely. Mr. President, Hamas is indeed responsible for sparking this latest fire that is now engulfing the streets of Arab capitals around the region. We have called them out on this openly for the heinous attacks on the 7th of October. But make no mistake, the kindling was already there, fueled by decades of violent dehumanization, dispossession, and despair. That is why we cannot, however convenient, lose sight of the context of this crisis, the longest-going occupation in the world today of a people that do not wish to be ruled and have been let down again and again and again by all of us. Mr. President, the UAE voted for this resolution not because it is a perfect text, but because it clearly states basic principles which must be upheld and which this Council is obliged to reinforce and uphold. We really thank Brazil and its delegation for their efforts, and we remain hopeful that in the coming days we can unite behind a resolution, and that also in parallel diplomatic efforts led by the United States help lead us all off this brink that we are edging towards. As I and others said yesterday, the current escalation must drive all of us, but most importantly, Israelis and Palestinians, to the urgent work of achieving the two-state solution. Let me be clear, the only alternative to that is the violence we see right now. 3 years ago, my country established diplomatic relations with Israel. The Abraham Accords are grounded in a simple but enduring truth that peace and dialogue are better than violence and enmity. Along with our Israeli and American partners, we sought a new Middle East where coexistence and cooperation deliver prosperity, security, and peace for all. The indiscriminate damage visited upon the people of Gaza in pursuit of Israel's security risks extinguishing that hope. The region is already contending with the spillover of this crisis, and the enemies of peace are unapologetic about their aims. Let us not play into their hands. Mr. President, it has been said over the past few days that this crisis is a test for the international community and for the UN Security Council. That is true. Noa Argamani, a young Jewish woman abducted by Hamas, is in her second year of computer studies at Ben Gurion University. Her mother is undergoing cancer treatment, and she is their only child. In a conversation with a journalist about the horror inflicted on this family, Yaakov recalled that in Gaza, too, families are mourning their children. He described Israelis and Palestinians as two nations with one father, and added that we can reach true peace, and I'm praying for this to happen. Amen to the hostages' return. 22-year-old Dunya Abu Rahma, an architectural student in Gaza, is one of the thousands of civilians today fleeing south. Last night, she told CNN that up until recently, all she had been thinking about was her graduation project. Now all she thinks about is how to be safe. The test, colleagues, is whether or not we sustain that hope for peace that shines even through a parent's unspeakable anguish and a child's aspiration to just be normal like the rest of us. We cannot doom millions of people to misery because diplomacy is hard. We must keep trying again and again and again. We must recognize that by continuing to fail to respond to the Palestinian people's legitimate aspirations for a country in their homeland, we fuel this unrelenting cycle of violence and hatred. Let us not fail this test for the sake of Israelis, for the sake of Palestinians, and for the sake of all peoples of the Middle East. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned. The 9,443rd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Algeria, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Libya, Oman, Pakistan, South Africa, Syria, and Tunisia to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Martin Griffiths, Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, and Mr. Thor Wennesland, Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Olof Skog, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of the item 2 of the agenda, and I'll give the floor to Mr. Thor Wennesland.
Mr. President, members of the Council, the Secretary General and I have briefed this Council extensively in private over the last days on details of the horrific and unprecedented events that have been unfolding, relaying our utter condemnation, shock and regret. I will not repeat my briefings here today, noting that I will report on the situation next week during my regular monthly briefing. My colleague Martin will brief you on the humanitarian situation. Today, I want to update you on where we are on my efforts over the last days to find a way to bring the end to hostilities and spare lives of civilians. I have to be very honest here and now and say that this is one of the most difficult moments facing the Israeli and Palestinian people in the last 75 years. The massacre and despicable acts of violence and terror perpetrated by Hamas against Israelis on 7 October are seared into our collective memories. Whole families killed, women and children abducted to the Strip and held up until this day. There is no justification or excuse of such an act of terror, and I condemn them unequivocally. We are facing a devastating and clearly difficult challenge for the region and for the international community. It comes at a moment when the global institutions will need to respond to such act and crisis. They are already overstretched. We are in a war, and wars are filled with horrific scenes of violence and tragedy. Last night I watched in horror and in real time, as I was sure we all did, as reports of mass casualties emerged from what should be a protected site, shielded from danger, a place of healing. Hundreds of Palestinians were killed, patients, and those seeking shelter when Al-Ahli hospital in Gaza City was struck by lethal fire. The circumstances of this catastrophe and responsibility still needs to be clarified, and we will need a fact-based fully investigation and broad investigation. But the result of all this is very clear, Mr. President. It is a terrible tragedy for those who were involved. I fear that we are at the brink of a deep and dangerous abyss that could change the trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, if not of the Middle East as a whole. After more than a century of conflict and over half a century of occupation, we, the international community, have failed collectively to bring the parties to a just, sustained political resolution. The long-standing issues run deep and extend well beyond the confines of Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. The events of the past 11 days have served to reignite grievances and reanimate alliances across the region. Based on my meetings and the dynamics I observe on the ground, I would say the following. The risk of an expansion of this conflict is real, very, very real, and extremely dangerous. Mr. President, since the outbreak of the current hostilities, it has been my absolute priority to work to diminish these existential threats. With the Secretary General, I have been in constant communication with a broader range of interlocutors, with the parties, with regional and international actors who have agencies and influence. I will continue to do so. Today, I speak to you from Doha, where the authorities have assured me of their continued commitment to the Palestinian people and their humanitarian needs, and the urgency to prevent any further loss of civilian lives. Meetings and ongoing discussions with leaders in Egypt have focused not only on the question of facilitating access to Rafah crossing on humanitarian assistance, but also our shared concern and efforts to rein in further regional hostilities. I will return to Cairo tomorrow to join the Secretary General to continue these political discussions. In this regard, we welcome President al-Sisi's swift call for a summit of world leaders to continue these discussions. I also had similar discussions with leaders in Lebanon and Jordan, as well as on repeated phone calls with the P5 and other key regional and international partners who are seized of an activity engaged and addressing this conflict. We are all seeking a common understanding and approach at this critical time. I welcome the visits of world leaders such as German Chancellor Scholz, the UK Foreign Minister Cleverly, and today, the visit by President Biden. With the parties on the ground in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Ramallah, my message have remained steadfast that we must not let the dynamic of the current conflict take our eyes off what I will call the day after. The day after we need to start working on now, immediately. We know the way forward. These days, I can tell you, diplomacy is very hard. But here is what we need to do. We need the time and space to achieve two urgent objectives. Hamas' immediate, unconditional release of all hostages. Secondly, and fast, unrestricted access of humanitarian aid for Palestinians in Gaza. The third thing must be a collective effort to end the hostilities and prevent any further expansion of the conflict to the region. Regarding West Bank and Lebanon, there should be no miscalculation, no provocation, and no step that closes the door for our current efforts. The step beyond must be down the path towards the political solution. Ultimately, the only way to bring the end to the bloodletting and prevent any recurrence of the to pave a way forward, a long-term political solution is needed in line with UN resolutions, international law, and previous agreements. As I've stated many times to this Council, a patchwork of ad hoc and temporary fixes and perpetual management of conflict without addressing underlying issues is not sustainable. That has been proven over the last 11 days. What we are seeing on the ground now, all too tragically, proves that this is true. What we must do now is to work together as one to achieve these objectives. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Winnesland for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Martin Griffiths. Martin, you have the floor. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, sorry, my technical knowledge, Sergio, is not brilliant. Thank you very much for inviting me. And what I was saying was what an honor it is for me to be on the same podium as Tor. And I associate myself profoundly with every single word that he said, which is born out of years of relevant experience, including not just looking at the horrors of the last 11 days, but anxiously looking ahead at the horrors to come. So all credit to Special Coordinator Tor Winnesland. But I also, of course, join him and all members of the Council in expressing my horror and despair at the explosion that he described, watching, as so many of us did, at the Al-Ahli Anglican Episcopal Hospital in the northern Gaza Strip yesterday evening. My heartfelt condolences, of course, go out to the grieving families affected by this heart-wrenching tragedy. And I also extend my sincerest wishes for a swift and complete recovery to all those who've been injured. According to the World Health Organization, the hospital in question was one of 20 in northern Gaza subject to the announcement by the Israeli authorities that civilians should leave for their safety. It's a terrible thought to think of that the morning after. However, evacuation for many had simply not been possible due to insecurity, as we have been discussing in this chamber this afternoon, the critical condition of many of the patients, and indeed the lack of ambulances, staff, and capacity in the rest of the health system, which, as you know, Mr. President, is on its knees in Gaza. When that hospital was hit, it was fully operational, and indeed it had breached its maximum capacity. It was therefore overflowing with patients, including women and children. Dozens of healthcare providers and caregivers demonstrating their extraordinary, frankly, extraordinary courage and commitment to remain sur place, remain there to do their duties and to remain steadfast by their patients' sides. And they were also in the building. And the hospital was also hosting numerous internally displaced people who either had nowhere else to go or were sheltering there in the expectation, or at least perhaps the hope, that it would provide safety. And they were wrong. So far, reports indicate hundreds of fatalities, hundreds of civilians and healthcare workers, and I associate myself with Tor's call for a fact-based inquiry to find out how this happened. Here I want to say one thing of the highest importance to all of us in the humanitarian community and those of us, all of us indeed, who are governed by the rules of war and international humanitarian law. What happened on the 7th of October in the invasion into Israel and the taking of those hostages still taken and hidden away in Gaza was simply wrong, against the law, unconscionable, unacceptable. Their unconditional release is an essential component of any return to the kind of normalcy that Lana was describing to us earlier before this session started. Since the 7th of October, 28 health workers in Gaza have reportedly been killed. 23 have been injured. There's no lack of courage. There's no lack of commitment in that population. There have been many reports of health facilities sustaining extensive damage. Indeed, the hospital itself had already been struck, as you know, on the 14th of October. Gaza's health services, as I've been hearing here in Cairo these last day or two, are being overwhelmed by the extreme challenge of meeting the healthcare needs of the rising number of wounded patients, all the while facing significant shortages of medical supplies, water, and fuel. And the destruction of that hospital yesterday heaped further pressure on this crumbling, this failing, this sad healthcare system. Not only were the victims rushed to Shifa Hospital, one of the many other hospitals in Gaza on the verge of collapse, but it also now deprives Gaza of a facility that cared for more than 45,000 patients a year before the current hostilities. So I am compelled to reiterate, and this will not surprise anybody, as everyone else has done on many occasions in this council, that under international humanitarian law, there are simple requirements. There are simple rules of war which are applied to all of us, whatever the provocation, and God knows there has been provocation. Parties to armed conflict must protect civilians and civilian objects, take constant care to spare them from any attack. We have discussed this in almost every other conflict in this chamber around the world. This one is no different. International law affords specific protection to medical personnel and facilities to ensure the wounded and sick receive the medical care they need. It was no coincidence that one of the first humanitarian leaders on the scene after those events of the 7th of October was our dear friend and leader, Dr. Tedros of WHO. It's imperative that the wounded and sick receive the medical care they need. It is imperative that the parties respect their obligations under international humanitarian law, and it is our collective responsibility. We are all involved in this. We are not observers. We are all involved in using all our influence to ensure that this is the case. This tragedy is characteristic of the crushing impact this conflict has had on civilians, and as Tor has been pointing out, and Lana earlier, the catastrophic consequences it will have if it continues to escalate as we fear. In just 11 days since that storming of Israel by Palestinian armed groups on 7th of October, The death toll, as has been mentioned, has already exceeded that of the 2014 hostilities, which lasted more than 7 weeks. The pace of death, of suffering, of destruction, of breaches of international law cannot be exaggerated. In Gaza, more than 3,000 people have been killed, more than 12,500 injured. Hundreds are unaccounted for under the rubble, and quite frankly, we do not know how many have moved from the north to the south to get out of harm's way. The death toll also, we all know this well, includes humanitarians. I want to pay tribute to the 15 UNRWA staff and Red Cross and Red Crescent personnel that I've been meeting these days, the families of those who have fallen. We estimate that maybe up to 1 million people have fled their homes to other parts of Gaza, but we don't really know. Many have done so in response indeed to Israel's announcement that civilians should leave northern Gaza for safety. But there is simply nowhere to go for civilians to escape the destruction and privation, both of which grow by the hour as missiles continue to fly, and essential supplies, including fuel, food, medical items, water, run low. Due to the scarcity of water, UNRWA in some locations, and I want to pay a special tribute to UNRWA for the way in which it's provided a buffer against suffering in these terrible times. And in UNRWA in some locations is being forced to ration down to providing 1 liter of water per person per day. Bear in mind that the minimum by international standards should be 15 liters, and they're getting 1, and they're the lucky ones. People have been increasingly forced to consume from unsafe sources. We're hearing many, many more reports of that through UNRWA and other agencies, placing the population at risk, of course, of the outbreak of waterborne diseases. And whether civilians move or stay, and that must be their decision, whether to move or stay, whether to move again or stay where they have moved to. Whether they move or stay, they must be protected. They must not be attacked in places of civilian infrastructures. They must be protected in places of deconfliction. And they must have access to the essentials of humanitarian assistance to survive, which are available and in which we have all spent many, many detailed hours in detailed negotiations with the parties, and I'm grateful to them, to all of them, for the commitment that they have shown to these negotiations. It means that the UN and the humanitarian partners, and I specifically refer to the great leadership shown, and I met their leaders today, of the Egyptian Red Crescent and the Palestinian Red Crescent, must be able to deliver relief to civilians in need throughout Gaza without impediment in places of their choice, in places where they consider themselves to be safe and where we can seek to ensure that safety. We have humanitarian supplies. We have medical teams. UNRWA has a staff of 14,000 in Gaza still, bravely working under these conditions. The other agencies do. The Red Crescents, of course, have many, many, many volunteers, and they are all ready to assist the people most in need. I'm very grateful to many member states for providing very quickly emergency funding available for the immediate relief in Gaza, including from the Central Emergency Response Fund that my office runs, and the Occupied Territories Humanitarian Fund. Thank you. Thank you to all of you who stepped up so quickly. What we don't have, however, we have a lot, but what we don't have, and it's the killer, and what we desperately need is immediate safe humanitarian access across all of Gaza. And that is the burden of our discussions with key parties. We urgently need a mechanism agreed by all relevant parties to allow for the regular provision of emergency needs throughout Gaza, to get the level of distribution of assistance up to what it was before these terrible weeks of 100 trucks a day providing assistance throughout Gaza to people in need. We need to get back to that level of ambition. For that, we need additional funding for agencies like UNRWA, World Food Programme, and of course for the Red Crescents in their leadership role. And without new funding, UNRWA, already painfully, woefully lacking in funds, will not have the ability to continue to deliver core services. But as Mr. President, as Tor said, and I'm glad he did, and he made two, I think, very important points. Gaza is not the only location of concern in this deeply troubling conflict. Since the start of the latest hostilities, the situation in the West Bank has also been deteriorating, as Tor said, and he should know. Last week was the deadliest week for Palestinians in the West Bank since the United Nations started recording fatalities in 2005, while settler violence incidents also have gone up from an average of 3 incidents a day to 8. Suffering knows no borders. Widespread closures throughout the West Bank are impacting the ability of communities to access essential services, and there is a real risk of the situation spiraling out of control. What the people of Israel, Palestine, the region need, what we all need, what this Council's mandate is in existence to secure, is the sanity and humanitarian to prevail, drawing on the provisions of international humanitarian law for urgent efforts, this was Tor's second point, to arrest any further descent in this brutal calamity. Lana said it very eloquently, the worry that I suppose many of us have, where will this lead us? Where will this lead us when the fighting has taken place? Of course, we implore the parties to respect international humanitarian law. And by the way, I want to be very clear, a humanitarian ceasefire would go a long way to easing the epic human suffering. Finally, Mr. President, I know I've gone on too long. I want to conclude by expressing my deepest admiration, gratitude, and comity for the extraordinary people who are delivering life-saving and humanitarian services in Gaza, in the West Bank, as they do in so many other parts of the world. Many of whom are displaced, many have lost loved ones, many of our staff in all our agencies have had that kind of suffering. The dedication and bravery of ambulance crews, healthcare professionals, people working in hospitals and clinics, actually is a reminder of the fundamentals of humanity which drive our efforts to resolve these differences, to resolve them through diplomacy, through dialogue, through kindness, through generosity, and through accountability. I also want to express my profound personal gratitude. I have said it also already for Tor, but also to my colleague and his colleague, our Deputy Special Coordinator, Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator, somebody with a title as long as mine, Lynn Hastings, and the humanitarians who are demonstrating unwavering commitment providing essential assistance and relief. Their collective efforts, their unstinting focus on key priorities which are based on operational needs, exemplifies not just the United Nations' enduring commitment to extending hope and support, but exemplifies the commitment of the humanitarian community and its supporters, all of whom are in this room, to do the job that they have decided and resolved to choose for their lives. Sergio, Mr. President, thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Griffiths for his briefing. I now give the floor to the members of the Security Council. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, colleagues, along with the delegations of the UAE and China, we initiated today's Emergency Security Council meeting given the tragic events in the Gaza Strip. Yesterday, as a result of airstrikes, the Ali Akha hospital was destroyed in the area of Gaza City. We are deeply shocked by what occurred. The Anglican Church Hospital was one of the 20 in northern Gaza that received evacuation notices from the Israeli military. However, it was impossible to meet that requirement, and Martin Griffiths already said that, given the prevailing unstable situation, the critical condition of many patients, and also the shortage of ambulances, staff, stretchers, and alternative accommodation for the displaced persons. The airstrike on the hospital, according to latest reports, caused over 800 deaths and injuries. We are calling for an objective investigation to be carried out and for the perpetrators to be prosecuted. Mr. President, colleagues, this is the price of the inertia of members of the Council, many of whom have procrastinated over the past 11 days since the start of the escalation surrounding Gaza. We warned you about this on Monday when a number of members of the Council, guided by, in inverted commas, purely humanitarian considerations, but actually by purely political considerations, did not support the Russian draft on the ceasefire. Our document laid out a number of specific urgent measures designed to stop violence and civilian suffering, designed to release the hostages and to prevent the impending humanitarian disaster in that part of Palestine and avoid the conflict spilling over into other countries of the region. Given the extremely tense situation, action should have been taken very promptly. This is precisely why our draft did not contain political elements or views or a mention of any party to the conflict that might have complicated reaching agreement on it. Despite this, in full view of the international community, the UN Security Council, the primary body for the maintenance of international peace and security, was not in a position to adopt a decision that could have prevented the humanitarian tragedy in Gaza. The Council did not send a clear, robust collective signal with a call for a swift, lasting, reasonable humanitarian ceasefire. Today, we have seen the terrible fruit of this. Once again, it's become clear that the position of Washington and some other Western capitals did not allow for a natural, logical decision to be taken. This, given the current circumstances, is an absolute key humanitarian imperative, and it is the moral duty of all responsible members of the international community. Furthermore, humanitarian considerations, the norms of international law, and the root causes of why the Palestinian question has not been settled, all things we've repeatedly and insistently stressed over recent years, of course, don't count for them. Mr. President, the number of injured and dead in Israel or dead and injured rather, was 1,400 and 3,900 respectively. And the number of victims in Palestine was more than 2,800 and 10,800 respectively. And today, these figures are even higher. As per UN reports, 450 children have died in Gaza, and some 750 are still under the rubble of the buildings destroyed during the airstrikes. More than 2 million inhabitants of Gaza still have no water, food, medical assistance, fuel, or electricity. The only border crossing on the border with Egypt, the Rafah crossing, once again is coming under missile fire and has not been opened up for civilian evacuations or the provision of humanitarian goods. De facto, the military blockade of Gaza has held hostage 1,000 Russian citizens and members of their families. Given this very worrying situation, the UN agencies, the WHO, UNICEF, the UNFPA, with one voice condemned the strike on the Al-Ahli hospital and called for a prompt active protection of civilians and medical infrastructure. Yesterday at the briefing on the situation in Gaza, the deputy head of OCHA, Joyce Misuya, noted that the number of victims of the current escalation in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that has gone on for 11 days has already exceeded the number of victims that were killed during the hostilities in 2014. The path to that ceasefire took some 7 weeks. This cannot fail to horrify us. Humanitarian workers are dying. The number of people forced to leave their homes in Gaza is about 1 million people. The humanitarian blockade of the Palestinian enclave is pushing the entire population to the brink, the population that de facto, right before our eyes, are being sacrificed. Mr. President, we would urge the Israeli side to prioritize international humanitarian law, at the center of which is the lives of Palestinian citizens and critical emergency care and medical facilities. Humanitarian access should be provided without delay. We call for an immediate ceasefire and an opening of corridors to supply emergency humanitarian assistance to the affected areas of the Palestinian enclave and to evacuate civilians. An immediate cessation of violence against civilians as well, irrespective of where they live. In a number of Arab and European countries, there have been outbreaks of large-scale unrest, given the ongoing Israeli missile strikes. In this regard, we condemn the attacks on diplomatic missions in foreign countries, of foreign states. Mr. President, all that we're talking about just now is happening with the inaction of the Security Council, which is paralysed by the self-serving interests of some countries and with unilateral actions which not only have ended in complete failure but also have led to a widespread escalation of violence in the Middle East region. Mr. President, we are extremely concerned by the unprecedented scale of the humanitarian disaster in the Gaza Strip and the high risk of the conflict spillover. Assuming the UN Security Council is not able to come up with an appropriate response to these challenges, we will initiate the resumed 10th emergency special session of the UNGA on the protection of civilians in Palestine in order to have a comprehensive discussion of the situation regarding the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and ways to settle it. A letter on this for the President of the GA has already been written and it will be dispatched forthwith. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
I thank Special Coordinator Tor Wennesland and Under Secretary General Martin Griffiths for their briefings. President, the airstrikes which hit the Anglican hospital in Gaza yesterday, claiming hundreds of lives and numerous injured amongst Palestinian civilians, is the reflection of the extreme brutality and gravity of the war between Israel and Hamas. Gabon firmly condemns these strikes and the responsibility for these must be established. We recall also that health units and their personnel must be protected in all circumstances pursuant to international humanitarian law. Since the barbarous, unjustifiable and unacceptable attacks of Hamas upon Israel on the 7th of October, the indiscriminate deadly violence against civilians has reached unsustainable levels. My country recognizes Israel's right to legitimate defense, which must be exercised whilst upholding the principles of proportionality and distinction between combatants and civilians. 11 days since the outbreak of hostilities, scenes of war marked by indiscriminate shelling are suffused with horror, with dramatic consequences on civilians. The dead and injured are now counted in the thousands. Atrocities against women and children and destruction are all immeasurable. In addition to the cynicism of using human shields, in addition to the rejection of hostage-taking of women and children, we at the moment are seeing millions of people under siege in Gaza, without water, food, gas or electricity, with death as their only prospect. It is time to bring an end to this deadly cycle of violence and this unbearable human distress. We call for an immediate cessation of hostilities and for the opening of humanitarian corridors to assist civilian populations in need in Gaza. All parties must abide by their obligations pursuant to international humanitarian law and allow for immediate, unhindered humanitarian access to those in need. I take this opportunity to pay tribute to the humanitarian personnel who are carrying out their activities courageously in difficult, hostile conditions at risk of their lives. President, the conflagration of violence between Israel and Hamas is jeopardizing peace, security and stability in the region and beyond the epicenter. The international community must exhibit greater commitment to prevent and avoid other fronts or poles of violence in the region, which would make the situation still more intractable. Exchanges of fire between Israel and Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon are, in this regard, extremely worrisome. This Council must urgently act to prevent the situation from becoming bogged down, above and beyond strategic interests for each member, above and beyond the depth of emotions. We must, without delay, achieve de-escalation and halt the fighting. We must silence the guns. Diplomacy, dialogue and negotiation, which are at the heart of the United Nations, are the inescapable channels to achieve a solution which guarantees the rights and interests of the parties. And for Gabon, the two-state solution still has no credible alternative. Thank you.
Representative of Gabon for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I wish to thank USG Griffith and Special Coordinator Westland for their briefings. I wish to particularly commend Special Coordinator Westland for his tireless efforts in actively engaging with all parties for the de-escalation of the conflict to prevent a humanitarian crisis. Together with UAE and the Russian Federation, China also requested this emergency meeting. The Al-Ahli hospital in Gaza was attacked, which claimed the lives of hundreds of innocent civilians. China is shocked by this heinous attack and strongly condemns it. The protection of civilians in armed conflict is a red line under international humanitarian law. Civilians and civilian facilities such as hospitals and schools should not and must not be targeted in military operations. The indiscriminate use of force is not acceptable, and the safety of humanitarian medical workers must be guaranteed. We urge Israel to effectively fulfill its international humanitarian law obligations. Look around in Gaza right now. Tragedies like the one at Al Ahli Hospital are unfolding all the time. As a result of the total blockade imposed by Israel, the supply of water, electricity, and fuel in the Gaza Strip has been cut off. The basic supplies, such as food and medicine, are dwindling and urgently needed. Tens of thousands of Gazans have been forced to move south because of the emergency evacuation order issued by Israel, but have suffered from airstrikes in the south as well. From the north to the south, Gaza is full of frightened children and desperate mothers. Under the current circumstances, there's no time to lose in protecting the safety of civilians, carrying out humanitarian relief, and preventing a humanitarian crisis. We call on Israel to lift the full blockade of Gaza, rescind the emergency evacuation order, and stop the airstrikes around the Rafah crossing. We welcome the international community's efforts to open a humanitarian corridor and look forward to substantive progress in the relevant communications and arrangements as soon as possible. We appreciate the important role played by Egypt and other regional countries. Mr. President, development over the past few days have amply demonstrated that an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire must be the overriding priority. As long as the war continues, more violations of international humanitarian law are inevitable. Without a comprehensive ceasefire, any amount of humanitarian assistance will be a drop in the bucket. If the current fighting in Gaza is allowed to drag on, the end result will not be a complete victory, military victory for any side, but rather most likely will be a catastrophe that will engulf the entire region, that will probably completely end the prospect for a two-side solution, plunging the Palestinian and Israeli peoples into a vicious cycle of hatred and confrontation. Arab countries have issued a strong call for an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire. The international community should heed this just call of Arab countries and the Palestinian people. We should unite all current diplomatic efforts towards this goal. China welcomes any initiative that is conducive to easing the humanitarian crisis and reducing the suffering of civilians, and supports all efforts aimed at de-escalating the conflict and restoring peace. We hope that all parties concerned will maintain impartiality, actively leveraging their influence on the parties concerned to promote calm and restraint and work for the cessation of hostilities as soon as possible. Under the current circumstances, all diplomatic efforts should work to send a unified signal. First, there are no winners in wars. Violence for violence can only lead to more serious crises. There must be an immediate ceasefire, abundant military means, and return to the track of dialogue and negotiation. Second, any violence and attacks against civilians should be rejected. Both the Palestinians and the Israelis have the right to be free from fear, and their security should be equally protected. Third, international humanitarian law must be followed. The basic needs of the people of Gaza must be ensured. The humanitarian corridor must be opened immediately, and the hostages must be released. Fourth, the fundamental solution to the Palestinian-Israeli question lies in the implementation of the two-state solution based on relevant UN resolutions and other international consensus to achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting settlement so that Palestine and Israel can live side by side in peace. Mr. President, the Security Council bears the primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security. In the face of the continuing spread of conflicts and the increasingly imminent humanitarian disaster, the Security Council has no reason to remain silent and no excuse to delay further. China does not agree with the claim that the Security Council actions will interfere with ongoing diplomatic efforts. Though the draft resolutions proposed by both Russia and Brazil have not been adopted, the Security Council cannot stop at this. China expects all members of the Security Council to face up to their responsibilities under the Charter, respond to the expectations of the Palestinians and the Israeli peoples and of the international community, move forward in unity and build consensus and make binding decisions on the current crisis situation, decisions that will stand the test of history and conscience. China has been making efforts all along. We will continue to work with the international community to play a constructive role for the ceasefire and the cessation of hostilities, the protection of civilians, and the prevention of further humanitarian crisis in order to realize a comprehensive, just, and lasting solution to the question of Palestine. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. And we have listened carefully to the sobering briefing by Special Coordinator Tor Wennesland and USG Matthew Griffiths. We remain deeply concerned by the unfolding developments in the Gaza Strip and Israel. At the outset, whilst reiterating our strong condemnation of the present hostilities initiated by the Hamas militia on the 7th of October 2023, we are profoundly distressed by the attack on the Al-Ali hospital in Gaza that was also sheltering civilians at the time it was hit. We condemn the attack, which adds to the growing frustration and human tragedy of this conflict, and we call for a full and transparent investigation of the incident and the establishment of accountability. Since 7th October, the world has witnessed unimaginable horror in southern Israel and in the Gaza Strip. Many lives have been lost, and many more will be lost if the fighting does not stop. We deeply regret the high civilian cost arising out of the present hostilities and express our solidarity and sympathies to all the families who have lost loved ones to the violence in both Israel and Palestine. Mr. President, Ghana believes that as a council and at this time, our foremost responsibility alongside that of the wider international community should be saving lives, all lives. In this regard, we call on Hamas to immediately and unconditionally release all hostages and concurrently urge both sides to halt the firing of rockets and missiles. We further urge Israel to restore essential services such as electricity and water supply to Gaza and permit humanitarian access of food and medicines to the vulnerable populations in Gaza. We note the efforts of the United Nations and other humanitarian partners committed to operating in the unfolding difficult circumstances and urge funding for the emerging humanitarian needs and for the flash appeal. In making these calls, however, we do not ignore the dictates of international law and the charter of this organization, including relevant resolutions which affirm the right of guaranteed territorial inviolability for the states in the region, including Israel, as well as their right to self-defense, nor deny the necessity of accountability for those most responsible for the egregious, horrific, and heinous incidents committed since Hamas initiated its attacks against Israel on 7th October. For many member states reborn into modern statehood in the last century, we cannot cease to underscore the importance of respect and adherence to the established principles of international law, international humanitarian law. Civilians and civilian objects must be protected at all times, and international law, which has been instrumental in the achievement of our respective statehoods, must be upheld by all, even in conflicts, to protect innocent lives, to safeguard security, and facilitate the aspirations for statehood. The deterioration of the security situation and the upward spiral of the violence poses the risk of a further spread and a danger to international peace and security. We therefore strongly urge a stop to the fighting, accompanied by the exercise of maximum restraint in good faith by all sides, to enable mediation to play its role in releasing the hostages and addressing all immediate concerns, including the growing humanitarian needs of the civilian population in Gaza. We must all make every effort to reverse the downward spiral and provide a horizon of hope for the people of the two nations. I conclude by reiterating Ghana's enduring commitment of support for achieving durable peace between Israel and Palestine. We believe that reinvigorating the Middle East peace process presents the most viable path for the international community to end the cycle of violence. The vision of a region where Israel and Palestine live side by side within secure and recognized borders should not be diminished even in this darkest of hours. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, thank you. Thank you very much for having convened this emergency meeting. I would also like to thank the Undersecretary General, Mr. Martin Griffiths, and Special Coordinator Tor Venesland for their very sincere descriptions of a very, very bleak situation. I'd like to thank them and in particular their teams for their efforts, their work, their courage in the most difficult of circumstances. I would like to express my condolences to the families of the victims of those humanitarian workers who have died. As early as the 7th of October, Switzerland very strongly condemned the acts of terror, the indiscriminate attacks and hostage-taking perpetrated by Hamas against the Israeli population. We call for all, that is, all hostages held in Gaza to be treated humanely and released immediately, and our thoughts are with them. Switzerland joins the Secretary General also in unequivocally condemning yesterday's strikes, in particular the one that, according to the United Nations, left hundreds dead and dozens injured at the Al-Ahli Anglican Hospital. We extend our deepest condolences to the families of the victims. This incident must be thoroughly investigated so that the facts can be clarified. Mr. President, we can but repeat it over and over again. The civilian population and civilian objects must be respected and protected. International humanitarian law also requires that hospitals, clinics, and the people who are treated there, as well as the medical staff who work there, be protected. The same applies to UNRWA schools, which are civilian facilities of the UN. At the same time, the humanitarian situation in Gaza continues to deteriorate rapidly. Water and power cuts are causing a serious health crisis. Nearly 1 million Gazans have had to flee their homes to take refuge in the south. The Gaza Strip is under complete siege. UNRWA schools act as vital shelters for the 400,000 displaced persons, many of them children. The capacity of these schools, as well as those of the hospitals, has been exceeded. All parties must allow the safe, rapid and unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid. We urge them to immediately observe pauses in hostilities and, as the Secretary General has called for, a humanitarian ceasefire. Mr. President, as we repeated after the vote this morning, all parties must exercise the utmost restraint in the conduct of hostilities. They must respect international humanitarian law, in particular the principles of distinction, proportionality and precaution, and human rights. All possible measures must be taken to avoid the impact of hostilities on the civilian population and civilians. As international humanitarian law takes account of legitimate security and military necessity, all its rules must be respected without exception. We stress the need to investigate all violations of international law so that the perpetrators can be brought to justice. The respect for international humanitarian law can also curb a spiral of violence that could ignite the entire region. Mr. President, Switzerland underlines the importance of the good offices of the United Nations in this crisis. We'd like to thank them. We welcome the Secretary General's visit to Egypt and the region. As Under Secretary General Martin Griffiths and UNRWA Commissioner General, Philip Lazzarini said yesterday in a joint statement, and I quote, "Humanity must prevail in Gaza. Humanity must prevail everywhere. De-escalation must remain the priority. As members of the Security Council, we must redouble our efforts to contribute to this and exert our influence on the parties, individually and